Hello, welcome back to Levant TV's press review for Monday the 18th of November 2013. As usual, I will start with papers here in the UK. The Guardian leads its front page with the headline "Security Chiefs Exaggerated NSA Leaks Fears", as it reports on Britain's intelligence chiefs exaggerating threats posed to national security by leaking NSA files. It also features a report from Amnesty International, which has raised fears about the exploitation of migrant workers in Qatar, and features a picture of Doris Lessing, who passed away aged 94. The Independent leads its front page with the exposed myth of global warming pose, as it reports on a study finding that failure to record temperature rises in Arctic explains apparent flatlining. It also features a picture of late British Nobel Prize-winning author Doris Lessing, as it pays a tribute to her, calling her a woman in flight. And the Daily Telegraph leads its front page with the headline "Tory blow as tycoon gives UK Independence Party millions". The paper reports that the top donor is to back UK Independence Party rather than the Conservatives at the 2015 general elections. It also reports on senior doctors admitting that hospital patients must be checked every day, including on weekends, and also features a picture of Dame Helen Mirren, who was crowned Best Actress at a ceremony in London. The Times also features a picture of Dame Helen Mirren, as she is awarded Best Actress for playing the Queen in Peter Morgan's play The Audience. It leads with the headline "It's time to cut taxes, Tories tell Cameron", as MPs say middle class must benefit too. It also features a story on child abuse videos to be permanently wiped from the internet in one of the biggest breakthroughs against online pedophilia. Now let's take a look at the top stories in the Middle East. As the Syrian conflict grows and intensifies, with the United Nations estimating more than 100,000 dead and millions displaced, let's take a look at recent developments. The New York Times takes a look at the progress with the chemical weapons program in a story headlined "West faces challenge in moving Syria chemical weapons through battlefields". Reuters' David Sanger reports that a plan announced over the weekend for getting the bulk of Syria's chemical weapons out of the country in coming weeks has raised major concerns in Washington, because it involves transporting the weapons over roads that are battlegrounds in the country's civil war and loading them onto a ship that has no place to go. Sanger notes that the security for the shipments is being provided entirely by Syrian militant units loyal to President Bashar al-Assad, adding that intelligence analysts and Pentagon officials say the shipments will be vulnerable to attack. Sanger states that the US official has noted that the choice now facing the United States and other nations was to either leave the stuff in place and hope for the best, or account for it, get it out of there, and hope for the best. That's the least worst option. Sanger adds that on Friday, Albania turned down an appeal by the US to destroy the weapons on its territory after thousands of Albanians took to the street in protest. The issue caused a major political dispute there as well. And he notes that Syrian al-Qaeda leaders in Pakistan and Qaeda-linked elements in Syria have made clear their desire to seize precursor chemicals, possibly to develop their own chemical arsenal. Sanger concludes that Syria have shown exceptional bravery in the past year in moving and consolidating their chemical weapons stocks around the country to prevent them from falling into the rebel hands. The Voice of Russia takes a look at the position of the opposition in its article "Syrian Opposition Seek Only Power, Expert", as it reports on an interview with President of the Institute of Middle East, Yevgeny Stanovsky, who says although the opposition has signaled it may be entering talks, the rebels only seek power. The article quotes Satanovsky, who says the opposition cannot be taken seriously because these people are radicalist Islamists of Jabhat al-Nusra, sponsored by Saudi Arabia. And these terrorists will not visit any conference. Their purpose is absolutely clear: the replacement of the regime, destruction of the Alawite Christians and all other Shia villages, and the death of President Bashar al-Assad. It adds that in a reluctant change of mind, fractured Syrian opposition coalition leaders seemingly dropped the initial demand that President Assad should ultimately step down as a precondition for any talks with Damascus. The uneasy decision was taken under concerted international pressure during Syrian opposition latest meeting in Istanbul after a heated debate which turned into a mud wrestling session involving key opposition figures. The article then goes on to quote Sergei Markov, member of Russia's public chamber and vice president of Plekhanov University of Economics, who notes there are too many obstacles. The first, he says, that the military opposition has a top radical position and they demand the resignation of President Assad. Secondly, the opposition is very much split and it is very difficult for them to decide who will represent them. And thirdly is the participation of Iran. It is more of a square that Saudi Arabia started this war in Syria, specifically against Iran, to block Iran and to crash Iran. Markov adds that I want to repeat the main reason when Saudi Arabia started the war in Syria, it was to isolate Iran and crash it, saying that Iran's participation in the Geneva II talks means helping it come out of its isolation. The article concludes that, however, despite still dubious success of the world diplomacy, the move may signify a turning point in the whole Syrian crisis, which has started in March 2011 and has already claimed the lives of more than 100,000 people, while millions were displaced or deprived of their basic rights. Amidst an increased influx of child refugees from Syria, the Lebanese Ministry of Education, with the assistance of international donors, is arranging afternoon classes to accommodate additional students. Imad al-Zughbi writes for Lebanon's As-Safir newspaper looking at this situation in an article titled "Lebanon's Public Schools Open Doors to Syrian Refugees." Al-Zughbi notes that sources in the educational sector revealed that the meeting held last week between representatives of international donors, the Ministry of Higher Education and civil society organizations led to an agreement as to how to welcome students. Sources who attended the meeting indicated that there was an agreement to open 70 schools to cater to the needs of Syrian students during their afternoon classes, on the condition that the donors commit to paying all expenses including registration, fees, books and hourly wages for principals, supervisors and teachers. Al-Zughbi highlights that the cost per pupil exceeds $650, covering all administrative expenses, hourly wages, fees and book costs. This figure does not include fuel expenses in mountain areas or rapid restoration operations, as the donors had already promised. And he adds that the sources pointed out that the problem lies in the number of students, with more than 45,000 placed on waiting lists. Al-Zughbi continues to say that the UN High Commissioner for Refugees pointed out its latest report that more than 41,000 children were enrolled in informal learning programs offered by the agencies in Lebanon. It also indicated that over 2,100 displaced children had benefited from the compensatory education programs and remedial classes provided by UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Save the Children and the Amal Association. Al-Zughbi adds that the report also noted that the first afternoon classes for displaced children were currently being adopted in Shib'a in southern Lebanon. The school offering these classes, which is backed by the UNHCR and Caritas Lebanon Migrant Center, welcomes all Syrians who have just arrived to Lebanon. Al-Zughbi adds that Director General of Education Fadi Yarraq tackled the issue in a speech of the 37th session of the UNESCO's General Conference, saying, "Despite our open door policy, we are facing difficulties to integrate the growing number of child refugees, especially girls of school age." Al-Zughbi concludes the sources expressed their fear of donors failing to settle the money they owe to the Ministry of Education on time. They noted that any delay in securing funds would automatically put off the launching of the afternoon classes. The ministry is unable to secure any sums of money and will not bind itself to any obligations lest it should fail to commit to them. As peace talks with Israel continue for full 9 months agreed with Washington, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas also called for an international probe to determine who killed Yasser Arafat, after scientists said it was likely he had been poisoned. Let's take a look at varied opinions on the inquiry. Writing for the Israel National News Network Arutz Shiva, Dalit Halevi claims that Mahmoud Abbas had a hand in assassinating former Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. In an article headlined, Abbas involved in Arafat poisoning, Halavi refers to former officer in the intelligence service of the Palestinian Authority, Fahmi Sha'ban, who blames the Palestinian Authority leadership, including its chairman Mahmoud Abbas, of being complicit in the murder of former chairman Yasser Arafat. Halavi quotes Sha'ban saying that the data and evidence point to the involvement of Abbas and other Palestinian Authority in the alleged poisoning of Arafat. Sha'ban says that in 2005, Palestinian Authority intelligence summoned for questioning a doctor from the Al-Mutalli hospital in Jerusalem. The doctor specializes in intestinal diseases. Instead of showing up for questioning, he said, the doctor flew with the nurse who worked alongside him to the United Arab Emirates, which also sponsors Mohammed Dahlan, who was expelled from Fatah because of repeated claims by Abbas that he had murdered Arafat. Sha'ban adds that the Palestinian Authority intelligence investigation found that the same doctor had received a visa from Israel to enter Eilat, even though he is a resident of Judea and Samaria. To conclude, Sha'ban challenges the appointment of Abbas advisor Tawfiq Tirayi to head the committee investigating the alleged murder of Arafat. He noted that Tirayi served under Arafat's command in 2003 and 2004, and that in 2005, after Arafat died, Israel cancelled his wanted status and gave him a VIP card instead. Agora Cosmopolitan, the Canadian national newspaper, features an article written by Dr. Abdul Raouf Kolashal, headlined, Yasser Arafat exposed anti-Islamic world. In the article, Kolashal claims that it is officially known now that Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat was murdered by Israeli agents crowding the Mossad or joint Mossad-CIA agents. But Kolashal claims that it does matter to UN or the UN National Security Council or the Quartet of Five established to protect and help the Palestinians to make a home for themselves to live in peace without being slaughtered by the Israeli state terrorists. The writer goes on to say that USA, which kills Muslims globally but makes loud noise about state murders by other terrocracies, does not open its dirty mouth about the assassination of Yasser Arafat, the most important personality of Middle East in recent times. Kolashal points out that the war on Islam launched by US-led NATO rogue states justifies any murder of Muslim leaders in the world. And he adds, thus the assassination of Yasser Arafat is destined to be forgotten as a closed chapter in the struggle for Palestine's freedom and independence. Kolashal goes on to say that it is indeed a fateful shame that we live in this cruel world without protesting against cruelty against Muslims and the defamation of Islam. And to conclude, Kolashal argues that anti-Islamic minds are not merely from non-Muslims from other religions, but among Muslims there are plenty of them existing for wealth-making by any means, but unfortunately harming the genuine interests of Islam and Muslims. With further analysis on the inquiry, Robert Fisk writes for The Independent an article headlined, "The real poison is to be found in Arafat's legacy," in which Fisk claims that Arafat placed vain trust in Israel and the US, a mistake which he believes people are now paying for. Fisk says that Arafat made so many concessions to Israel because he was growing old and wanted to go home to Palestine before he died, that his political descendants are still paying for them. Fisk points out that Arafat had never seen a Jewish colony on occupied land when he accepted the Oslo Agreement. He trusted the Americans, he trusted the Israelis, he trusted anyone who appeared to say the right things. Fisk adds that it must have been exhausting to start his career as a super terrorist in Beirut and then be greeted on the White House lawn as a super statesman and then recreated by Israel as a super terrorist again. Fisk refers to Arafat's illness and flight to Paris when the Israelis suddenly turned humanitarian on Arafat. Fisk recalls the first murmurings about poison which he didn't take very seriously. He says, "If he lives, I thought the gossip will stop. If he dies, he will have been poisoned. As surely as Napoleon was poisoned by the Brits, as assuredly as 9/11 was a CIA plot, so he died. And so, of course, we were told he was poisoned." Fisk also recalls Suha Arafat, who referred to her husband's death as a murder, and how from that moment, murder it became. Fisk argues that French medical authorities made extensive tests to see if Arafat had been poisoned, before and after his death. They found no trace of poison, and the French had bad relations with Israel at the time. Now, according to Fisk, the 60 samples taken from the old man's remains and clothes led to the Swiss investigators to say only that evidence of polonium moderately supports the idea that he was poisoned. The Russian investigation is inconclusive. The French haven't yet told us the results. Fisk also recalls Palestinian poet Edward Said, who told him that in 1985 Arafat said, "If there's one thing I don't want to be, is to be like Haj Amin. He was always right, and he got nothing and died in exile." Fisk explains, hunted by the British, Haj Amin, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, went to Berlin during the Second World War in the hope that Hitler would help the Palestinians. It was the greatest blunder any Palestinians has made. Arafat, according to Fisk, followed that blunder by going to Baghdad and embracing Saddam Hussein after his invasion of Kuwait, believing Saddam would liberate the land he called Palestine. Arafat wanted to believe Saddam like he wanted to believe the Americans and the Israelis, and his legacy of vain trust has destroyed any hope of a Palestinian state. That is the poison we should be studying. To conclude, Fisk refers to the way American media likes to map out the ethnic, religious, racial front lines of the Middle East. How to tell a Sunni from a Shiite was my favorite Time headline, he adds. Varied opinions there on the alleged poisoning. Perhaps Robert Fisk's methodology is valid, albeit being somehow too politicized, going a bit off track in his analysis, given the nature of the inquiry, which is merely on whether there was any poisoning or not. Now let's take a look at the top headlines from international papers. Starting with Russia's Moscow Times, which leads its front page with the headline, "Olympic Doping Lab Under Scrutiny." The international New York Times leads with the headline, "Phantom Keeper of a Tainted Trove," as it takes a look at the son of a Nazi-era dealer who lived as a shadowy recluse amidst priceless artworks. The UAE's Gulf News leads with the headline, $200 billion opening as the 13th edition of the Dubai Air Show opened this weekend. And finally, the Jerusalem Post leads with the headline, "Netanyahu to Hollande, Israel will not be bound by a bad agreement with Iran." As French president says, Paris demands guarantees Tehran will abandon its nuclear program. That was all for today. We will do more reading and get back to you with more headlines and analysis tomorrow in another press review.